Hi, everyone. I'm Lisa Escárcega. I am running for State Board of Education, Congressional District 1. I am here with Jen Bacon today. Jen is a member of our Denver Public School Board and is a candidate for House District 7 representative. So good to see you today, Jen. How are you?
I'm good. I was just joking. I'm so glad to be virtually out. I've been, like on the Zoom and Google Hangout meetings every day for work. And I was like, I'm going to put on some earrings today and brush my hair. So thank you. This is a big component to my mental health.
There you go. Well, I keep seeing it. I'm missing my commute a little bit, right? That commute from the bedroom to the other bedroom, it gets a little jammed up sometimes, but I don't have a lot of time to process. So so before we get started, I thought the other thing I would mention is that you and I are both endorsed by the Colorado Education Association for our positions. Have been having a lot of contact and work with them, and I just want to thank them for their support and talking about some of their issues and what's important to them, right, is what we have in common. So I think that's wonderful.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. So how is, there's so many things I want to ask you. We always talk about things, but let's talk about obviously what's on everybody's mind, and that's the COVID-19. You're working with Denver. I'm at the state level right now working with 178 school districts on this issue. What do you see as, we're doing so much focus on short term, but we can talk really right now, what are you all working on short term, but then what do you see some of the long term impacts and your thoughts as you're thinking about running for the House district and what might need to be done or
Well, I will say, we were chatting briefly before we got online. In the short term, we've really been focusing on what is it that public school brings to community on a whole scale level, right? This is beyond just thinking about instruction. And so in the short term, we realized a few things. One, we as Denver Public Schools are one of the largest employers in the state, not just city and county of Denver.
I think you're the 5th in the state, last I heard, yes.
Yeah, and so we also support 93,000 students, 2/3 of whom are on free and reduced lunch, right? And then finally, the role school plays in people's everyday lives, right? And it's not, and it's funny because, a lot of families, you're seeing all these fun memes of like, I will pay a teacher now forever because kids are at home. But like the disruption, right, of having kids at home with families that are working, with families, that can still have to get up and go to work. We had to realize all of those things as we talked about shutting down. And so we were one of the last educational institutions in town to close. We saw our universities closing. And, the state was talking about how do we flatten the curve. But as we made that decision, we had to process all of those things. And so what people saw from us, and I've been calling our work like in phases, right? Phase 1 is the triage. How do we help with those 3 immediate things? And so we have really strong values at the Denver Public Schools, with our superintendent, our senior leadership team, and the board to say, we will pay our employees. So how do we pay people? Because to all of those 15,000 employees, if they're not paid, that's an incredible disruption to their life on top of the crisis of what's happening with health. We will feed our kids and now the community. So, Denver Public Schools is feeding Denver, and we're happy to do it. People invest in us.
Well, and I've explained to people that you don't have to be on free reduced lunch. I mean, you're feeding anybody who is a Denver Public School student and their family. They can come in and get food.
Absolutely. For breakfast and lunch, we worked with the city. The city stepped up to provide dinner. We're now delivering because we've been learning and evolving through this. We're learning about internet access and access to transportation, and we hope we can be a voice for our community when we talk to these other agencies because of what we've learned. And the last thing that we moved into, because, you know, when we closed, we're like, let's just extend spring break and see where this is going to go. Then it was like, maybe this is going to take a month. Then like in the East Coast, they're like January. We're like, absolutely not. In the meantime, let's figure out how to support kids in their learning, because we believe that access to education and literacy is a human right, right?
Yes, right.
I know there are a lot of questions about equity. We believe that having school occur is the lesser of two evils. We know for sure students won't have access to literacy, access to online engagement or continual engagement with learning if we're not open, right? But we know at least with remotely, we are invested. We'll go buy every Chromebook in America. We've delivered 40,000. That kids should have access to something, because we know what the consequences are, particularly for our younger kids without, you know, like you can tell all the things in the world about how their lives will develop if they haven't been able to develop and grow their literacy by the time they're in third grade, right? So all those things we talk about with school to prison pipeline and, you know, number of beds, we know that having a literate community is fundamental for a healthy one. And so we just decided to invest in that. And so, yeah, in a couple of weeks, we're going to be like, how much does this cost? But right now we're like, do what we need to do to survive, you know? And that's how we want to contribute and support. There's an absolute fun and terrifying component to this, is that now our families are our educational partners. And we have to be intentional about supporting that. And, you know, not everyone, it's not just easy. And I see Christians on the call. It's not like, hey, teach, you know? And so we're seeing new appreciation for teachers, but also we're seeing new appreciation for like people have a chance to reflect. Everyone went to school in their life. Now they're like, oh, how did I actually do this? You know, versus just getting up and going. So we think that's kind of fun.
I've heard from our teachers that this is a really unique experience. And now they are not just educators for students, but they are working one-on-one with so many parents. And we've also got, you know, concerns around, this is not as much Denver, but across the state, about using things like Zoom. And suddenly you have this window into a child's home. You have all that. Where I think when you were talking about the impact, right, that this is going to have, and yes, we are going to have inequities, but if we can support 80 or 90%, we have to do that. We also have to then figure out how we're going to get to the remaining 10%. I heard some figures the other day that something like 55,000 students in our state still do not have access to the internet. So out of the 935,000 that we have, there are kids who talk, you know, real inequity there just to even start. But when we think about, I know you all are talking and I'm hearing all over the state, do we have summer schools? Do we do some kind of compensatory education? And then my thought about this is, I know when we come back next year, and this was the governor, you know, bless his heart, who said, well, we'll come back and hopefully we'll be ready in the fall. We'll jump right back in. Accountability will start up. We'll be ready to roll, right? And yes, we will. Hopefully with the, you know, changes in the restrictions, yes, we will be back in school. But I believe the impact of this couple months of learning, of course, hits our most vulnerable students more. But we will be dealing with this impact probably for several years to come. So I'm trying to think of ahead of time, what policies, what things do we as leaders need to be thinking about when we look at things like test scores, right? We have benchmarks for what is a quality, what's a performance school. Our scores are going to drop probably. Will that need to change? We don't have data for educator evaluation, probably even for next year. So I think we're getting this year, all these waivers, right? I think this is going to be our test year, certainly. And we are going to, though, we're going to have to be actively foreseeing some of these longer term issues before suddenly it becomes next April and say, oops, wait a minute, what happened? You know, And so I don't know what your thoughts are about any policies, anything in particular you've thought of?
I mean, who knew when I decided to run for HD7, like who knew any of this? You know, I mean, honestly, at DPS, I should have predicted something. I mean, since I've been on the board, it's something every 6 months. It's like superintendent search, teacher strike, now, you know, and I think where we are right now is actually a very critical time for two things. One, to actually evaluate the systems that we've been operating under for the last 10 years. This whole COVID crisis has created, if you will, a natural break for evaluation. And, you know, I believe, you know, as someone who, you know, my day job, I train people on how to do policy. A very critical component to policy is that policy is cyclical and it needs to be evaluated and adjusted. And we are at this time where we can do that, right? And so 10 years ago, we created the systems of school performance frameworks and teacher evaluation, right? And, you know, like performance-based anything, funding, access, or whatnot. And we are going to have to evaluate that and question that because we can't just pick up. And it requires 3 levels of agency to do so. And so in a lot of ways, I'm actually glad that I've had this experience for so many reasons, but being on a school board and going to the state house, right? Because the things that you mentioned, local school boards don't do on their own. So, you know, DPS, and Lisa, you've been great with being on our SPF committee, reimagining the SPF, but that didn't come from Denver entirely, right? So we do have our own school performance framework, but the state says you have to have one, right? You also, like testing, it's not something that local school boards do. The state does that. And the state board, right, is the executive agency that monitors school performance, teacher performance. Teacher licensure is not determined through the school board, right? And so if our schools are quote unquote failing, we have to respond to the state and the state board, right? If our teachers are not, you know, performing, we have to respond to the state board, and then the state legislature creates the statutes to which you are monitoring, right? And so all of this is going to actually need to happen in the next couple of months. And you know, all right, kudos. You know, Governor Polis has definitely worked in education before, but we are not just going to walk into August.
That's right. I know. I saw it and I was like, oh, you know, he's doing a great job. So we'll just.
That's okay. And that's why you have people around you who know this stuff. You know, you don't need to know everything. You need to know people who know everything. You know what I'm saying? And so, like, when you're talking about summer school, right? The way that impacts the district is we would have to pay for that. We'd have to pay for staff and buildings. However, like the notion of compensatory education or extending a school year is done at the state level, right? Like people don't know that we can't just, and the district's responsibility to that is in relationship to contracts. So this is why DCTA and CEA cares. It's not like they don't want to teach anyone, but we only pay them, you know, from August to June. And so like we have to figure that out. And so like this conversation, and I've reached out to the education committee to be an advocate, because guess what? To the feds now, right?
Yes.
The feds
for the
fund
money.
Special education, and compensatory education is actually a term used in special education, right?
Correct.
And like the feds can reimburse, like the meals, you know, we are paying, that's Title I dollars. That is not, you know, Denver Public Schools now feeding parents and everyone else. We're paying for that, right?
Yes.
But for the free and reduced lunch. So like now we need to talk to the feds about how to support us. So all of this is going to converge in the next couple of months. And the reason why it's important, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was going to say, and you're also paying for preschool, right? You're paying for preschool. You're paying your educators. You're not getting reimbursed for that. Right. There's some differences in funding there, right? You're doing a lot.
So DPS has always been, you know, really diligent about saving. You know, this is what reserves are for. And we've been really diligent about our values, because all of this comes back to the role education and public schools play in community, you know? And so we understand our responsibility with that. And we want to do everything that we can to provide education, to bring kids back to in person, because there's also so many other things that happen outside of instruction. School is the safest place for a lot of our kids. So we need to be worried about mental health and abuse and domestic violence. You know, we have nurses and counselors. We need to be sure kids are fed. We need to be sure families have the space to go to work and operate because they're in our care. And so that's why public school is important, but it also interacts with so many layers that is critical to be on the same page so that we can be this public service that our community really needs.
Well, and to your point about evaluation, so, and you do policy, I do policy as well. And I was actually a program evaluator for a long time. I was a federal program evaluator for programs, and we do have a bill that got stalled right inside the legislature, and that was to do an audit of our accountability system. And it's based on that premise of exactly what you're talking about, is that you just don't put, and this is what we tend to do, we just continue to put policy in place. And it, particularly with our state, we've not done a good job of setting goals and setting either sunset inside of education bills. We just, and we say, well, we want test scores to go up. And then as a program evaluator, you know exactly what happens. If you don't set and say, well, based on the resources we've put into it, here's what we would expect to get from this. And did we meet those targets? Well, they never set any targets. They don't set the goals. At the end of the day, we just sit there and argue for the last many years. We argue, did it work? Did it not work? That's the READ Act, right? That has come in. We just wrote, when we rewrote the bill, and I helped rewrite this part of it, where we did say, yes, we need an evaluation of this program, and we know it's going to cost money. Every bill that sets out programs should have money in it for evaluation, so that we know 3 to 5 years, you do both a ongoing, formative evaluation. How do we change the program to better it as we go? But then also at the end, that summative, did it do what we wanted it to do? And we've tried, we've talked with Nancy Todd. This is something I would really hope that I can support you with and work in the legislature on, is to get that kind of evaluation or normal cyclic review into any new education policy. We joke about it in our field. The original state law policy book, used to be about this thick. And my book right now is about that thick. And they just add on, and we don't really take away. And if you talk to any educator out there, any teacher, probably their number one top maybe 3 issues they're going to tell you is just the number of additional things they've been asked to do. And we don't take anything off, and they still have just their normal hours of the day. So
I get it. I was in the classroom when No Child Left Behind became a thing, right? Before ESSA. And I remember
2001.
I remember my day fundamentally shifting. I went from teaching 5 subjects to now doing 200 minutes of literacy. We did Success for All, and then there was those things. And it was and maybe we'll teach social studies and science for 30 minutes twice a week. Then it was all of these things. And don't get me wrong, teachers love their jobs, right? This is not about people not wanting to do anything. It's about a balance of what we're doing and understanding the experience so that we can streamline it. Senate Bill 191 and the READ Act, there's nothing wrong with saying, here's what kids should learn by the end of the year, right? As a teacher, I'm actually a fan of assessment. Now, I'm not talking about 90 hours of testing, but what assessment means to an educator is, did you learn what we taught?
Informative assessment, right? That's something that gives me information on where to go.
Right, it could be, and so it's okay to say, here's what we should be doing and what a child should learn by the end of the year. But we need to evaluate not only for the crowding of a day, but also to move forward. 2020 is not 2001. It's not 1995. And so naturally, I think policies need to be evaluated and reassess because time is moving forward, you know, and if we're going to be progressive at all, then we need to adjust. So, you know, what I said to CEA is like, I think it's okay to be supported by a veteran teacher, whether that's evaluation or to provide feedback so you can get better. Our system has become punitive. And also, if you're going to have someone help you do that, they should be a veteran teacher, you know? I think
or at least an expert, yes.
Experience in that instead of just, you know, you taught for a year type of thing. And that's like an evolution, right? This isn't, not everything has to be villainized, you know? But if we don't evaluate, like you're saying, we're just going to fall further and further down, you know, like the trench, if you will. And we're going to get in the way of helping ourselves be better.
Yeah.
For sure. You're right. I just flashed back. I'm like, it all started with Ron Page.
I did. You know? I remember that when No Child Left Behind in 2001, that very first year, and my job was to educate people on the law and all of the pieces that went to it and the requirements. And just remember going, oh boy, here we go, you know. And I had one administrator raise their hand and say, okay, Lisa, when is this going away? And I said, I'm thinking not before you retire. I'm sorry. And it's true. The new iteration has definitely given us some flexibility. But again, things evolve, like the research and what we know about reading, even those kinds of things that we didn't have in 2001, right?
Yeah.
So policy should change with that. Great. So I'm looking forward, Jen, to working with you and continuing on the work both with the Denver Public Schools, and then when you're in the legislature, I'm on the board, and we can continue this. And I think your background for this and everything is just awesome. So appreciate you talking with me today.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for running for this and sharing with people what the role of the state board is. You know, I think the longer I've worked in education, and particularly in Colorado, I've noticed that people's access to engagement is power. And part of that power is literacy of it, right? And knowing who does what and why. And so this is really cool to be able to not just run for something, Lisa, but to share with people why it's important and what you do, you know? And so
take it to the people, as I say, you right? Take yourself, be out there.
For sure.
Very
important. So I'm also glad you're running and people know what you do, so they stop yelling at me. Like
we can point fingers at each other.
Yell at the state. I know.
It's Denver.
I know. I'm like, it's not just Denver. Like it's everybody, and it's like status and chart, all that stuff. I'm like, it's real. It's not. You know,
Denver did not create that.
Exactly. So thank you.
You bet.
Personally, on behalf of the delegation.
You bet. Okay, great talking to you. Have a great day.
Bye, y'all.